Hello and welcome to another episode of Property-Pxrn Stars, the premium property podcast. And in this episode, our guest, our star, is someone a bit different to our usual run of guests. He is a business transfer agent or a business sales broker. It's Adam J. Walker, who I'm particularly interested, get my teeth in, to talk to about kind of starting with the end in mind as far as agency goes. But Adam, I think that business sales broker or transfer agent, you know what that means, but maybe to myself and others in the industry aren't quite so familiar with those terms. So what does that mean? What is it that you do?
Well, business transfer agent is the technical term, but no one really understands what that is. So I use the term business sales broker now. And essentially when people want to retire or sell their business for other reasons, I will run a proper competition, prepare the business for sale, and make sure they get the best price and the best terms for it. So I'm a bit like an estate agent for companies.
An estate agent for estate agencies.
Yeah.
So, okay, cool. So there's loads of stuff that I want to ask you about. But maybe before we get into that, is it worth sort of giving the listeners a bit of a run through of your history into where you are now and how you've ended up doing what you're doing and a bit of your, I suppose, track record of expertise in this market as well?
Thank you. Well, I started in agency in 1980, which just shows just how old I am now. I started at the bottom with a firm called Duncan Gray. I was trainee negotiator and I worked my way up to branch manager and branch partner, and that was sold in 1987 to Nationwide Building Society. I managed to leave, just before it was sold, and that's then made me look for a new career. For a brief while, I ran a training and consultancy business called Arrowhead Training, and that was running sales and management training for estate agents and consultancy work. And my biggest client in that capacity was Aviva, who were Norwich Union in those days, and they asked me to set up an estate agency for them. We built that very quickly to a regional chain across the southeast, and then 2 years after we started it, they decided they didn't want to be appointed reps anymore, so they didn't need an estate agency. So I was asked to help to sell the branches back to the managers. And that's how I started selling businesses. That was 1992 that I did that.
Right, okay.
So it's funny how, some of these fundamental things that you do in life start by accident.
Yeah.
And since then, we've sold well over 600 businesses, all estate agencies and letting agencies.
Yeah.
They've got a total value of more than £1 billion. And there's really no one else that does it on the scale that we do or has got that level of experience over 32 years.
Well, it's really interesting. And I think that this conversation is really, it seems like it's very important now because of a lot of the ways that companies are being set up. There's a lot of change in the industry at the moment. I suppose there's always some sort of change. But there's a lot of change in the industry, and I think that it is sort of important to start with the end in mind, because otherwise you could be potentially building something which doesn't quite have the asset value that maybe you would have once hoped it to have had. So just a little bit of sort of recent history, because I remember a time where, was it Countrywide that were going around and hoovering up estate agencies left, right and centre?
Yes.
And that is, my knowledge on this is pretty limited, but that seems to have stopped, especially from the valuation of sales businesses into much more valuing lettings portfolios. And so what is the recent history of that? What's caused it? And where are we at today in terms of valuations, I suppose?
Well, when I left my estate agency in the late 80s, it was a residential sales agency. That lettings had hardly started in those days. And in those days, they were being sold to banks and building societies who wanted the mortgage business. These days, it's letting agencies that are selling, and there is a lot more logic to buying letting agencies than there ever was in buying sales agencies. And the mathematics that drives it is, if you've got a letting agency that does £1 million of turnover, if it's well run, you might make £200,000 profit. If you pick up that business and drop it into somebody else's office down the road, it'll make £500,000 profit because of all the economies of scale.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter how big you are, there's someone bigger still that wants to gobble you up.
Yeah.
And that is what's driving this huge, great acquisition market.
Yeah.
And it is almost irresistible for somebody to sell out for the prices that they're being offered at the moment, because the buyer will still get 25% return on capital with very little risk, and the seller gets a price that would never be justified from the profitability of their business. So it really is a perfect storm.
Yeah. And yeah, there's so many things I want to ask you. And in terms of there's always someone bigger, that was interesting, that something that you said there. When I think of the biggest, I probably think, is Le Monde the biggest in terms of buyers at the moment, or?
It does vary hugely from month to month, and
Right.
what you find is that one of the big acquirers makes a big acquisition, and that satiates their appetite for a while.
Yeah.
And then the others step in, and then they make a big acquisition or spend their budget. So who the best buyers are literally changes from week to week. You mentioned Countrywide earlier. They, of course, at one time they were worth £1 billion. They then had a disastrous period ending with Alison Platt's stewardship. At the end of that period, it was in serious trouble, and Connells bought it for an absolute bargain basement price. And it was a fantastic buy for Connells. They put a lot of hard work into getting it back into profitability and focusing on the basics. And having bought Countrywide, their appetite for acquisitions was satiated for a little while. But they are now back in the market again.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting how, although they've been out for a long time, they're now starting to fill in some of the remaining gaps in their network.
Yeah, so Countrywide's a big one to digest. And it just as a side note, it is interesting. Maybe I'm sure it happens in other industries as well. But when he said it's worth over £1 billion, I also thought about Purple Bricks that was worth over £1 billion and then sold for £1 at the end of all of that as well. I think does this happen everywhere? It's just
I did write an article about that at the time, actually, saying that
really?
I didn't think that that value would last forever.
Purple Bricks or Countrywide?
Purple Bricks.
Yeah.
Purple Bricks, yes. And it really did skyrocket and then crash with a vengeance.
Yeah, a bit of a unicorn. Okay, so just come back over some of the things you said there. Maybe this is quite a big topic, but if you were to read the news as a landlord or a prospective landlord, you might be put off doing it because it all seems to be doom and gloom in the press. And please correct me if I'm wrong about that, but it seems to be doom and gloom. So you would think that would filter up the chain to valuations of letting agency businesses if there was a fear of a perception that all these landlords might be running for the hills.
Yeah.
What's your take on all of that and the value of lettings businesses in that context?
Well, there are relatively few new landlords coming to the market at the moment, but the existing landlords will stick with it. And although they huff and puff and complain about the compliance regime and the extra costs and the new regulations, when they look at selling, they look at the capital gains tax bill they'd have to pay. For those that bought in the early 90s when prices were low, it will be absolutely enormous.
Yeah.
And they say, well, I'm not paying the tax. Because you sell your letting portfolio, you pay the tax, you then reinvest the proceeds in something else. Well, what else would you invest in that's going to give you the same return with such a high level of security?
Yeah.
And the returns that you get for many years to come will be eaten up by the huge tax bill that you just paid.
Yeah.
So for that reason alone, I think that the great majority of the long-term landlords will stick with it.
Yeah. And also, rents are, I'm no expert on the rental market by any stretch, but seem to be ever increasing, and all of the, and understandably, I think it's not a great time to be a tenant, but with rentals increasing as they are, you think that would somewhat begin to offset increases in interest rates that landlords are paying as well, potentially?
Well, they didn't mitigate the trebling of interest rates that we had after Liz Truss's premiership. But interest rates have now peaked and are settling down again. and the rents have gone up. And the way that a book typically looks at the moment, a letting agent might have lost 10% of their properties a year for the last 2 or 3 years. They would then have got 5% of new properties from, poaching business from other agents or new landlords coming to the market. So the net loss is perhaps 5%. And the rents have gone up by 5 or 10%, which means that the income remains the same.
Yeah.
Or even grows a little bit. So lettings income has actually been remarkably stable over the last few years.
And then in terms of valuations, now I appreciate I'm sort of maybe a little bit putting you on the spot, but and there'd be multiple factors that would go into why a business would sell for what it is or what it isn't. I have this written down, and maybe this is wrong, and maybe this is old, and I can't remember whether it was from you or someone else, but I had from a sales business valuation that it'd be valued on 70% of the pipeline and 10% of the stock on market.
Yes, that's a little misleading because it's only one way of valuing things.
Okay.
And
did put you on the spot there.
It's important to realise that the value of a letting business is fairly stable. The prices do go up and down according to world events, but there's always a market for them.
Yeah.
With the sales business, you get 2 or 3 years in every cycle in the housing market when we get good money for them, and then something happens like the Brexit referendum vote, or Lehman Brothers going bankrupt, or the withdrawal of Miras back in 1987, which was the big one, or the banks pulling out of the mortgage market in 1980. But there's a world event. Overnight house prices crash, the volume of sales crashes, and sales agents are worth nothing again. And then they sit in the doldrums for 4, 5, 6 years, and then the market recovers and the window of opportunity opens again. So the cycles are normally about 8 or 9 years long, and I think give it another 18 months perhaps, and if we have a better year this year for the income for sales agents, I think sales businesses will be more valuable and in more demand in about 18 months' time. Really?
Okay.
And that the window will open for a couple of years, and then something else will happen, and the cycle will repeat itself.
Yeah, and you've just seen that happen over an extended period of time.
I've seen it happen over very many cycles.
Yeah.
We sold a single office sales only business 3 weeks before the referendum vote for £5 million. And if they had tried to resell it 3 months later, they'd have been lucky to get back 10% of that.
Bloody hell, talk about timing.
So it's just extraordinary.
I can have a guess what that was, but I won't. So that's really, really interesting. Okay, anyone's listening with the sales business, give it 18 months. And then from the lettings point of view, is it less cyclical in that sense and more?
The variations in letting prices are not nearly as dramatic as they are in sales. The sales values go like that, and the letting values go
much more
like
steady.
that.
Yeah. And again, this is me putting you on the spot with possibly out of date information, which is only one part of a bigger context. But I had 1.5 to 1.7 times fully managed revenue written down from a note I'd made ages ago.
Yes. And the problem is this is a bit like valuing a house on square footage. Is it in Mayfair or is it in the north of England?
Yeah.
So there are lots of other factors that come into play.
Yeah.
But for a fully managed letting business in central London, we might get 3 times turnover or pretty damn close to it. For a let-only business in the north of England, particularly if it's in a remote rural area, we might be lucky to get 1 times turnover for it. So there is an absolutely huge variation in the multiples.
Yes.
But generally speaking, London is a law unto itself, and the more central the better. The big cities get much better prices than the smaller market towns and smaller cities. And the ones that we find most difficult to sell are the ones that are in very rural locations. And the problem with those is that they're sold on profit, not on turnover, because if you are an hour from the nearest town, there is no one to gobble you up. So you have to sell it as a standalone business based on profit.
Understood.
And some of those do take a little while to sell. We sold one a couple of months ago that was 2 hours from the nearest motorway junction.
Wow.
And we had the devil's own job on that one until we found someone who wanted to semi-retire to the area, and bingo.
yeah.
Suddenly it went.
And there you go. So maybe just to break this almost into chapters, but we want to sort of come back to this subject maybe at the end as some more like practical advice for people that are thinking about selling or even setting up their business to sell. But I wanted to get into some not so much sort of quick fire things, but some specific points that I wanted to ask you about that. And this is stuff like I've got my preconceived ideas about, and they might be completely wrong, but this is a very selfish podcast because I want to understand this from you. And I thought, well, let's have the conversation and record it. So if I was to start an estate agency, and would I be advised or ill-advised to put my name above the door?
It's a really interesting question. And there's not a simple answer to it, because
Get off the fence.
if you are a very well-known manager of a corporate chain in the area and you've been there for 15 or 20 years, your name is familiar to people and it has a real value, so it will help the business in the early days. The problem is that when you come to sell it, you have to prove that you are not the be-all and end-all of the business, and it's not a one-man band. So if you can grow it to a size where you can afford to take a back seat, and you've got a salaried manager and a professional valuer and a team of negotiators and a lettings manager, and you are able to go in a day a week and just oversee it, it does then have a value. Mm-hmm. But if the business is John Smith & Co. and John Smith does every single valuation and negotiates every single offer and deals with every bit of sales progression, if John Smith isn't there, then the buyer naturally worries that the business is going to be worth far less without him.
Yeah. I'll tell you my preconceived idea and you can tell me whether it's right or wrong. And I suppose you and I work in very different spheres, but I think the one thing we probably have in common is we've spent a lot of time talking to lots of independent estate agents. But so I think the answer to that question of putting your name above the door, I think is short-term gain, longer-term pain. And I'm not just talking about selling it necessarily, but the short-term gain is exactly what you said. People know, like, and trust your name. Oh, great! Now I can deal with them specifically. Perfect. And the two problems that really come out of it. One is like you said, the sort of the proving of the asset versus the personal effort in it. A bit like if you were selling a car and took the engine out, you have to prove that's not the case. Yeah. And the second thing as well, which is on a more day-to-day thing, is that even without looking to sell it, if you want to take a step back, if it's David Lindley Estates and it's doing well, people are going to want to ask for that person, and they're going to want that person. It's harder to step back or harder to bring people into the business because there's that name association. So my personal opinion, this isn't necessarily a plug for my business, but I think what's nice is you have the personal brand and the business brand working together, and then you can lean on the personal branding benefit of it and have all of that, but without pinning the whole business to yourself personally, and you can have that step back. So that was really, so okay, so if you're going to put your name above the door, you've got to prove that you're not the engine in the car. You've
got to be very sure that you can prove that the business has got expertise beyond yours.
Yeah, okay. That's sensible. That's cool. That makes sense. So,
it reminds me actually, with my old business, people used to ring up and say they'd like to speak to Mr. Gray, and we used to say, well, he died many years ago. I'm afraid that won't be possible. But it was the name above the door.
Yeah, and yeah, it's funny. So, you probably be much more eloquent about this than I would, but it seems to me that there's been kind of waves in the industry. There's a wave of corporate agents, and then maybe a wave of online agents, and now the big wave that's sort of coming across the industry is the wave of self-employed agents.
Yes.
And so that's seen a humongous growth for a whole load of reasons. This stat's a little bit out of date, maybe a couple of years, but I remember 20CI said there was the market share of self-employed agents had increased by 500% in about a 5-year period. Yeah. But it does raise an interesting question, and obviously there's a lot of reasons for people to become self-employed and earning potential and lifestyle, all of that sort of stuff. But it does raise an interesting question when it comes to eventual asset value and exits. What's your take on that? Where would self-employed agents sit in terms of an asset value of their business?
I think for John Smith, the self-employed negotiator, they can make a fantastic living out of it if they're good, far more than they'd be paid working for one of the corporate chains.
Sure.
But the income will only carry on as long as they're there. It's not a saleable asset at the end of it.
Yeah.
Because they never have staff and never pretend that they're going to do anything other than deal with it personally.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very legitimate career path for really good negotiators.
Yeah.
But it's never going to have any capital value for them.
Yes.
For the people who are who own those self-employed business models, I think there is every chance that they'll make good money out of it in due course. But at the moment, if you look at the accounts, none of them are really making much money out of it.
Yeah.
And I think they're in the building stage at the moment, and they will probably monetize it more successfully as time goes on.
Yeah.
But it's an expensive thing to get into, and
as a brokerage, expensive to get into.
As a brokerage, because you've got to recruit the people in competition with all the more established firms, and that takes money and time.
Effort,
So we need to watch the space very carefully, but I think some of them will start to get the formula right, but they haven't done yet.
Yes, that was kind of what I say somewhat preconceived idea, because I don't really remember. I did actually very briefly pick your brains on this at the negotiator conference that just went at lunch before you did a speech, because it was, I think I said to you at the time that was my gut feeling about it, but it wasn't necessarily proven in any way. But that it does add up from a logic point of view. So just very briefly explain what my business does is with By Design, we aren't sort of a self-employed brokerage in the traditional sense. What we have is license holders, and then what they do is then they recruit agents underneath them. So we set them up as a brokerage.
Gotcha.
We even provide all of their marketing, the contracts to do that, all the training and so on, even a person who is a recruitment specialist to help them do that. Yeah. But that is a very common conversation I have with people that I talk to about By Design, which is our business, is that they feel like they're on a hamster wheel. And it's a very lucrative hamster wheel while they're running, great, but where's the retirement plan for that? Because once they stop working, the income stops.
Yeah.
And how do they build something there? So by building their own brokerages within the network, then they're building something of value. And that was my theory, but never really proven. Still not proven because they've not sold one yet. But what you're saying makes sense, because they're building a business which is an asset which theoretically they could remove themselves from, and that's where the value arises. Is that right?
But you can have a branch of an estate agency business that's lost money every year for 10 years, put the right manager in, and it becomes profitable almost instantaneously.
Overnight. Yeah.
But it's their skills and their drive that does that. And it's the same with the broker models. People get frustrated that they're working in a pool commission system where they're banking 3 times as much as everyone else, and yet they only get paid an extra 50 quid a week. And they resent that. So it's a very good way for them to go out and earn what they're worth. And of course, it's been very much more developed in the United States, where a very common model there is that the broker pays a monthly fee to the office of 20% of their turnover, with a minimum of £1,000 a month perhaps, and that pays for all the infrastructure for the office, and they keep everything that they get above that. So the business owner gets their 20% regardless, and the broker can make millions in some cases. So it turns the whole risk upside down, and that's quite a common model in the States. I didn't
know that, but that. Sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but that is kind of what this isn't a podcast about me, but that's what By Design is. So we charge a flat fixed fee, if you like, so that equivalent of that, and then the agents who are building the brokerage as well keep 100% of their commission sort of on top of that, if that makes sense. So that they're not giving away big percentages. It's more of a small overhead than it is a
and
cost
it's
of
a
sale.
good way of getting the best and most capable people in the industry to work for you.
Yeah.
But as far as, and it will build something of value as far as you're concerned,
Yeah.
as long as you've got enough of them.
Yeah.
But as far as the individuals are concerned, they will earn a good money while they're there, but the moment they leave, it'll stop because they're not building anything that's got
Which is why,
residual value.
that makes sense. The two things is, one is that's why a lot of them are building their own brokerages within it, if that makes sense. So they're taking on self-employed agents. And then the second thing, this is just a very small point, but it's a funny thing. You say invert the model, just to invert something you said, is that maybe it's just unique to our model, but they don't work for me, I sort of work for them. That's kind of the same but different, if that makes sense.
Providing the service that they paid for. Yeah.
So maybe you've got some experience with this from the States. How would you value a brokerage business then? How does that work?
Well, that is actually quite good secure income, because if you've got 1,000 brokers and each
Do you mean
1,000 self-employed agents working for you, and you know that the turnover rate is 10% a year, and there's a proven track record that they leave and you recruit them with other ones, and you've done that for many years and it's profitable, you have got a good secure income stream, and that has got a real capital value.
We're in the building stage for sure, and it's interesting that a lot of, just probably because of like I said, it described it as a bit of a wave. I think we're quite early on in this wave, maybe still in the UK, but there are some really big organisations like EXP. They've got hundreds and hundreds of agents in, so they're probably they're well on their way with that, which is really interesting. Why do you think that's happened now, and why do you think it hadn't happened before? And by that, sorry, I mean the rise of self-employed agency in the UK.
I think because in years gone by, those people would start their own estate agency, but they now can't because the banks are not lending money anymore. So, and if they will lend it, it's on very unattractive terms. They want an unlimited personal guarantee. So a young chap who's done really well as the manager of a corporate chain used to go to the bank and borrow £100,000 secured on the business, or a limited personal guarantee on a buy-to-let property that he owned. He would then work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week to make a success of the business. And lo and behold, we've got John Smith & Co. estate agents. But now the banks are not lending money anymore. They can't do that. So the only option open to them is to come and work for you as a self-employed agent, because the setup fees are nothing. Yeah.
Okay, it's funny. Like when I thought about that question, I much more thought about the straightforward earning potential. That I think that as an industry, there's a lot of sort of criticism of ourselves, I suppose, and that the salaries and so on are actually quite low. I'm making broad brushstroke generalisations.
But it didn't used to be that way, because a lot of the old traditional partnerships, if you were good, they'd make you a partner,
and that's where you
get a share of the proceeds. But to be a partner, you had to buy in, and to buy in, you had to borrow money, and the banks are no longer lending money, so you can't.
It's really interesting.
And most of the partnerships are now selling out or converting to limited companies. So the share structure is different, so they can't buy in anymore. So the routes by which capable people used to become wealthy have been closed off to them. You can't start your own business, you can't buy into a partnership, you can't buy a minority shareholding in an existing business. So the only route is to become self-employed and work as a broker.
That's so interesting. That's genuinely so interesting.
And for all the use the banks are, they might as well have shut the doors and turned the lights out.
Just not interested. They're just not interested. Okay, so moving on the conversation a bit, what I want to talk about was maybe there's two sides of the same coin here, but let's talk about what are the most common mistakes that business owners make when they are in the context that we're talking about. So not necessarily at the point of sale, but throughout the creation and structuring of their business, all the way through to the point of selling it. What are the biggest if you could wring someone's neck and say, don't do this, what would be the things that you would say, don't do this in order to get the best value for your agency when you come to sell?
Well, we could talk about this for hours, if we go right back to the beginning and every mistake they've made since the business started. The first thing to stress is that at the moment we are only selling letting agencies or businesses that earn at least 40 or 50% of their income from lettings, not sales.
Mm-hmm.
And the buyers of those businesses are sophisticated and rational buyers.
Mm-hmm.
And they know that if they buy £1 million of turnover and pay £2 million for it, they'll get 25% return on investment with very little risk.
Yeah.
So it does make absolute sense for
Yeah.
them to buy those businesses. And even if they're losing money when they buy them, they can turn it round overnight by
Yeah.
shutting the premises and getting all the economies of scale.
Yeah.
So the buyers are sophisticated and are acting in a very, very rational way.
Yeah.
If we go back to the beginning, so the first mistake that people make is to have a business that is more sales than lettings because
Mm-hmm.
it's never going to have much capital value.
Okay.
Now that's not necessarily a mistake because somebody might value a high income during their working life
Yeah.
and not value the exit price.
Yeah.
And it's like buying a business, it's like buying a buy-to-let property in the north of England where you can get 15% yield but no capital growth,
Yeah.
or buying something
good analogy.
opposite Harrods where you get 1% yield and
Phenomenal
15% capital growth. So
Yeah.
neither is wrong or right, it's just what you want.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
people need to understand that sales businesses are never going to be worth anything like as much as letting businesses.
Yeah.
They will be worth twice what they are now, or maybe 3 times what they are now, but they're never going to be anything like the value of a letting business.
Yes.
So they've got to decide at the outset that they're going for high income or an exit
Yep.
payout,
Yep.
because you can't have both.
Yep.
And most people don't think about it, it just happens by accident.
Yeah. They prefer sales. They
yeah.
prefer lettings. And
where you open is important. You need to pick the town with care. And opening in, Mayfair because you've always worked in Mayfair is not necessarily the right thing to do when, a neighbouring borough might have less competition and better prospects. So a lot of people do choose the wrong area. You've got to have enough funding behind you. A lot of people have failed because they've just run out of cash.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter that you've got a pipeline of £1 million. If you can't pay your salary bill this month, you're going to go bankrupt. And
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what the future's looking like. The cash flow is an important thing. A lot of people who start a business never learn to read a balance sheet or a set of accounts or understand credit control or any of the other skills that are necessary to run a business. And it's interesting over the years that I've seen fantastic estate agents who've had businesses that are worth very little and mediocre estate agents that have had businesses worth tens of millions of pounds because they were good businessmen, not good estate agents.
They're two different skill sets. You can have both, but they are two different skill sets.
But you only have both if someone teaches you.
Yeah.
And a lot of people never get that opportunity,
Yes.
which is a shame. I suppose, once you've built the business and you've grown it and you've invested in it and you've made it profitable, the most common mistakes that I find when people get to sell them, the first one is just taking an offer from someone who approaches them directly. And I just cannot comprehend how people can spend their life telling people that they shouldn't sell their own house to their next door neighbour. They should, focus on putting it on the market with an agent and they'll get a better price.
Yeah.
And yet they sell their business to someone who just knocks on the door one day.
Yeah.
And there are well-documented cases of people selling businesses for half what they should have done because they took a direct offer from a competitor.
Yeah.
So, whatever people do, they must go out to the market. They really do need, advice from a broker who would expose it to more people and get a better price than they would ever achieve for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So selling to directly is a huge mistake. The second mistake is poor preparation. It's astonishing how many times we get a business questionnaire and it's just got basic mistakes in it that the numbers don't add up. The number of properties doesn't equate to the turnover. It's things that take 5 minutes to know that they're wrong. And if you send a business out like that to a buyer, they would just assume that everything that you've told them is untrue, and it goes straight in the bin, and that's the end of that. So there's a huge amount of time goes in to checking the numbers, making sure they all correlate with the accounts, and also making sure that they're prepared in the best possible light, because the way that a business is presented can have an absolutely enormous impact on the price that's achieved. For example, how much of the business comes from let-only properties, which is worth far less than income from managed properties. And very often people make the mistake of putting in all the setup fees from the managed properties with the let-only properties. So the let-only properties are apparently producing 300,000 a year of income, and in reality it's only 100,000 of income. So that simple mistake could cost them £250,000 on the price that they achieve. But no one knows that unless they're doing it all day, every day, which is what we do. So the other thing that matters is showing the profit of the business, and the profit shown in the accounts is often very low because people don't want to pay tax on it. And it's very common for husbands and wives to be on the payroll but not really work there, and sometimes sons and daughters are on the payroll, and there's family cars that go through the business.
Putting everything they can through it.
All sorts of things like that. And then there's mistakes that they make, like they refurbish an office and it costs £100,000. And instead of capitalising that and then amortising it over the 5-year life expectancy of the refurbishment, they just take the £100,000 hit in the first year. Whereas if you capitalised it and amortised it, then that would add £80,000 a year of profit to the last year's accounts, which when we're selling it could be £350,000 of extra purchase price just by an accounting trick. And this is not short practice, it's not trickery.
No, it's not an accounting trick. It's
presenting the accounts in the true light to show the underlying profit of the business rather than the profit that's shown in the accounts. And we don't try and pull the wool over people's eyes. We set out the profit in the accounts, each of the adjustments and the adjusted profit, so that if they disagree they can adjust them back or disallow them. But very few people have got the skills to do that. And if you overcook it, the buyers just won't accept it. And if you undercook it, you get less than you could do for the business. So it's, again, things like that, I often say that the price we determine for a business is very largely determined before it goes to the market because of the work that goes into creating the marketing pack, which is huge. And then once it goes to market, the next stage is to make sure that enough buyers are offered the opportunity to look at it. Now, we won't send it out to 100 people because that's damaging and something can leak out, but you do need to make sure that there are ideally at least half a dozen carefully chosen buyers so that there's a proper competition. And we know which the buyers are, we know which ones are paying good prices at the moment, we know which ones are trustworthy and which ones will chip the price later. And having a proper competition with different people competing in a fair way, again, will make a huge difference to the price that's achieved. And the way we work, we have a 6-week marketing campaign normally with a closing date at the end when they all make their offer on the same day. And that means that everyone feels they've been treated fairly. And we get the best offer in the first round rather than having a Dutch auction and just annoying people so that they don't want to, if something does go wrong, we don't have any underbidders to go back to. And again, that's, something else that you can't do for yourself, is to run a competition in that way with a formal closing date. Probably one of the biggest mistakes is to take the highest price without regard to the other factors that are important.
I wanted to ask you about this.
And it's not just the headline price, is it £50 a week for the next 200 years or is it all paid up front? What are the terms of the deferment? How likely is it that you'll get the second payment? Are they taking all the staff or are you going to have big redundancy costs to pay? Are they taking the premises or do you have to deal with the cost of disposing of the leases, which can be huge in some cases? What's the reputation of the buyer? Do they have a reputation for chipping the price at the last moment and, you know, using sharp tricks to pay less than they first offered? Or do they have a good reputation for behaving ethically? So just taking the highest price is by no means the right way of getting the highest price in reality.
It makes sense. I heard a bit of a horror story directly from the previous owner of the business who'd sold his business, and it was on I don't know the exact terms, but it was a 50-50 deal where half was paid up front, then half 6 months, a year, something like that.
That's that's a lot of money to defer for a
Well, they didn't see
long
the
time.
second half of it.
Yeah.
Not because there was sort of get out terms in the way the business was managed thereafter and so on. And it was a big corporate. You know, you would know who I'm talking about here.
I can guess actually. And they did it to so many people that it became nigh on impossible for them to get any offers accepted.
Really?
We refused point blank to deal with them.
Really?
And I told them that and why.
Yeah.
They're no longer buying businesses, so it's
that's the end of that anyway.
Under the bridge now.
Goodness me, that's really interesting.
But they were the worst of all of them.
Yeah.
But you know, at the other end of the scale, we had a business where 3/4 of the way through the sale, the owner's son died at the age of 29 from a brain tumour, and the poor chap was so devastated. He said to his accountant, you know, I can't cope with this. I give you power of attorney. I'm going abroad to see my other son. I've no idea when I'll be back. I just trust you to do what you think is right.
Wow.
And the buyer could have bought that at half the price that was agreed and no one would have tried to stop them. And they completed it on time at the price agreed without any argy-bargy.
So who you sell to is critically important.
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental.
Yeah.
And then the next common problem is that they allow the buyer to chip the price after it's been agreed. And there are literally 100 ways of doing that. There's the crude ones, like ringing them on the morning of completion, literally, and saying there's been a really nasty article in the Times this morning about the property market, and I'm terribly sorry, but we're going to have to take £250,000 off the price, and if you don't like it, you can get stuffed.
Yeah.
And at this point, you know, the staff have sometimes been told, and it's just catastrophic to walk away from it.
Yeah.
So there are some that are as crude as that. But there are many other more subtle ways to do it. So pretending that there are problems in the due diligence when there are not, or they're solvable. Or using accounting tricks to steal money in the completion account. So they'll give you money with one hand, and then they'll take it back with the other by manipulating the accruals and the prepayments and the debtors and the working capital.
Yeah.
You know, technical accounting terms that most people are not familiar with. And yet it's the easiest thing in the world for people to lose £500,000 that way.
Oh, I bet.
We sold one, I always remember, a few years ago, and it was to a corporate chain. And the regional director, we had a huge argument about the working capital. And he said, well, you know, when I sold my business, you know, they kept £500,000 of working capital. And so I know that's perfectly normal. And during the course of the conversation, you could hear it slowly dawning on him.
The penny dropping.
Yeah. And that was 5 years previously. And that was the first time that he realised that he'd been diddled out of £500,000 that he shouldn't have been.
Jeez Louise. So a question sort of mainly for my benefit, but this is a premium property podcast anyway. Does it matter what part of the market you work in? So typically we deal with sort of the upper quartile, the top 25%, but there'd be people listening that maybe don't. Does that have a bearing on the valuation at all? Positively or negatively?
Not really.
Okay.
What matters is how well the business is run.
Yeah.
And, you know, does the buyer think that they can make a profit from it? And if you're earning, you know, if you've got 1,000 properties at very low rents, but you're charging very high fees, and it's very profitable and your running costs are low, there will be a huge market for that. And if you're running a business in, you know, London Zone 1, and you've got super discount fees and no profit, that could be worth very little.
Yep, that makes sense. Final few questions. In terms of the don't worry, this isn't a crystal ball time, but in terms of the future of valuations, both lettings and sales, where do you see those going? What indications have you had about those in terms of market peaks, troughs? And I appreciate there's a million and one things that could impact this, but as far as your reading of where we are now goes in the cycle.
Well, unfortunately I left my crystal ball on the train on the way here, but it is very difficult to predict, and when it happens very suddenly indeed.
Okay.
So the Brexit referendum vote, we lost every single deal in our pipeline in the week after the referendum vote.
Really? Wow.
And you just think, what has the referendum got to do with a letting business or a sales business in the UK? It's irrelevant.
Yeah.
But the market was spooked, the lenders withdrew their funding, and overnight everything collapsed, and it took us quite a while to resell them.
Wow.
And the value of a letting business recovered quite quickly. The value of a sales business still hasn't recovered, and that was the beginning of the current cycle. The day after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, the same thing happened. We lost every single deal in the pipeline, and
goodness me,
the value of a letting agency halved overnight.
Yeah.
Why? Because there's mortgage fraud in the United States. Well, how in God's name does that affect a letting agency in London?
No.
But again, it spooked the markets and they pulled the funding.
Good time to be a buyer though. Money's been made while there's blood on the streets.
Well, there was one London firm who was the only one buying at the time, and they bought things at a half, maybe a third of what they'd be worth now. So all credit to them for having the nerve to keep buying when others wouldn't.
Yeah. I've just thought of another question I wanted to ask you actually, sorry, and this is just pertinent because it was in the news this morning. So just your take on this really, I don't know whether there is a take on this, but it's pertinent. In the news this morning there was a brokerage has bought another, presumably smaller brokerage. So there's a company called The Agency, and they bought a company called Isla Alexander, and they bought another one previously called The Estate Agency. Do you think there's going to be more of that goes on, this sort of consolidation? Do you think I don't know, have you got any opinion on that
this
whole...
is in the self-employed market?
Yeah,
yes. It's a logical way of doing it, because buying 100 ready-made brokers is probably quicker and cheaper than going out recruiting them one at a time.
Yep.
So I can see some logic in that.
Yep, that makes sense. Sorry, that was something that popped into my head there. So you were talking about the future of it and these big global sort of black swan events that come through and impact things.
So when there is a change, it happens very suddenly indeed, and it then takes a while for the market to recover. The last two times, the value of letting agents has recovered very quickly. The value of sales agents has taken much longer. After Lehman Brothers, it was a short, sharp shock, and it did recover quite quickly for sales. After Brexit, we had Brexit, then we had COVID, then we had Liz Truss, and it just seems like we've had one thing after another that's depressed the prices. Yeah. So I think the value of a sales business will probably be twice as much in 18 months' time as it is now.
Wow.
But that's from a very low base. But I don't set the prices, I run the competition. Yeah. And even though I've done several articles to say that I think sales businesses are very cheap and a very good value, no one has agreed with me yet. We still have real trouble selling them. Yeah. But I think, after a good year's trading, their values will recover. Letting businesses are currently selling for the highest multiples we've ever achieved.
Really?
And I think that will probably remain, because the return on investment for the buyers is still perfectly acceptable. Yeah. And they do get some real economies of scale. I mean, very often, because of their investment in PropTech, they can get rid of half the property managers because AI and the PropTech that makes them so much more efficient.
Doing some of the heavy lifting for them.
Well, when someone's toilet went flush, you don't have an hour of telephone conversations with the tenant saying how inconvenient it is and how they've tried to mend it with a paper clip and
it's put on an app. And
it all goes on an app, and they report it online, and the contractor is booked online, and there is no human involvement in the entire process, which means that it costs 50 quid less than it would have done otherwise, as far as the agency is concerned. Yeah. So they do get huge economies of scale. They are selling all sorts of products that the independent agents are not selling, like the zero deposit replacement and things like that. So as long as they run the business well post-completion, they should get decent return on capital.
Okay, that's interesting. Right, my penultimate question before my ridiculous closing question is a question about a question, I suppose, is what questions should I be asking you that I haven't? I'm conscious that this is your area of speciality. I know very little about it.
Right.
And what should we be talking about for people that are listening to this podcast in terms of best practice, pitfalls, things to do, things not to do, timing, structure? What questions should I be asking you?
Well, we've talked so far about using a broker versus selling a business directly. What we've not talked about is the difference between me and the new brokers.
Okay.
And, I have had some new competitors that have appeared quite recently. And the thing that we can offer fundamentally is that, I've been doing this for 32 years. My staff have worked for me together for 52 years between them. So we've got an enormous amount of expertise and contacts that no one else can come close to. And that really does impact on every stage in the process. We've got, more technical knowledge to prepare the information pack. We've got better relationships with the buyers. Some of them have bought 60, 70 businesses from us over the years. So, we've got a mutual respect for each other, and the buyers would prefer I didn't exist at all, but as I do, then they want to get on with me.
Yeah.
And at least they appreciate the fact that they get accurate information, that businesses are correctly priced when they go to the market. We don't put things on for twice the price that they should have been, or half the price, and then have a silly bun fight with mad offers.
Yeah.
They respect the fact that we run a fair competition where no one gets any preference in the offers. And they respect my technical knowledge, so when things go wrong, which happens often, I've got the technical knowledge to put them right again. And there is, every time I think I've come across every problem in the world, another problem arises.
Yeah.
We had one recently where we got to due diligence, and the owner had retired abroad, and it turned out his son had stolen the client account. And I've had thefts in the family, from staff before, never from members of the family. We had one where he'd made a simple mistake with getting licenses in London, and the local authority brought in new rules that you don't just need an HMO license, but you need a license for all properties in a certain streets within the borough, even if there's only one person renting them. And they hadn't noticed the rule change and hadn't applied for the licenses. And the potential fines for that was £6 million, which is just beyond bonkers. And you can go into Sainsbury's and threaten the shop assistant and run off with all the cigarettes and whiskey and be fined 50 quid if you're unlucky. And yet you can make a technical breach of regulations for where no one has suffered any damage or loss or danger. And there's a £6 million fine. I mean, it's beyond mad.
Just trying to catch people out, isn't
it? But we had a PI claim of 3 weeks before completion where someone fell through the roof of a building trying to mend a skylight, and there was, not a proper health and safety schedule had been registered. So there was a £1 million PI claim that nearly derailed the sale. So whatever you think is the worst problem ever, you get a
more bananas one.
Another one, but there is nearly always a way around them through warranties and indemnities and other protections.
And I'm not just saying this because you're here, but I think that's why you probably need an expert if you're going to do this, come to sell or buy, but do it properly.
The vast majority of private sales and the ones done by the inexperienced brokers fail to complete. And the reason for that is that the buyer makes an offer at a price they never intend to pay and then spends many months then trying to reduce it.
Back it down. Sorry, I lied. There was one other question I wanted to ask you. It's a quick fire one. High street versus not on the high street. Any material change to asset value?
It's becoming less and less important, and COVID showed us that you don't need to be on the high street to run a successful business, and that most of the visitors are not fundamental to your success. And increasingly people are moving to cheap space out of town or first floor premises, and it doesn't seem to be having much impact on their business.
So it's interesting the way you put that, because you were saying that it's not not being on the high street isn't dampening prices. But say I'm setting up my estate agency today and I'm not calling it David & Co because you told me not to. Would I be advised to set up on the high street or not on the high street? Just in the context of, I know there's loads of reasons for and against, but just in the context of asset value.
Well, the first thing is you shouldn't be doing it from scratch when you can buy a sales business so cheap.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very good point.
So what I would probably do is to buy a ready-made sales business on the high street, and then the moment the dust had settled, I'd shut the high street premises down and move it somewhere a bit cheaper.
I like that. That is a very straightforward, good advice, and I do believe that. I know someone who's bought several sales estate agency businesses for very, very good value, as you say, because you can get them for very good value.
Well, you can buy them for their pipeline value at the moment.
Yeah,
which is
earlier,
crazy.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. Adam, I think I've grilled you for nearly an hour now. Okay. Time flies when you're having fun and being interrogated, but I found that really, really interesting. Sorry, one last, this isn't a question, this is my ridiculous closing tradition on the podcast, so I'll brace yourself. So this podcast is Property Porn Stars, and
I'm
you
not
are
taking the shirt off.
Well, you agreed to come on the show. Everybody, whether they know it or not, has a porn star name, and that's comprised of your first pet's name and your mother's maiden name, and the top of the leaderboard is the most ridiculous name of all. Matt, who usually co-hosts with me, but he's not here today, he had the most ridiculous for a long time, which was Kevin Tiny. And then we had a previous guest a few weeks ago that is, it is good, isn't it? That topped his. I can't remember what it is on the top of my head now, but it was so ridiculous it did top his. What's yours?
My first pet's name.
And your mother's maiden name.
It's not going to be very funny, I'm afraid.
Don't worry.
It's George Hale.
Do you know what? It might be the most boring one we've ever had. So at least top of the leaderboard for something.
If it helps you, my mother was teased very much at school as a child because her first name was Mary, and they used to call her
Hail Mary.
They used to call her Hairy Male.
Right, okay. I thought you were going to say Hail Mary, but that's much worse. We'll go with that then. That's a bit funnier. Brilliant, Adam. I really, really enjoyed that conversation, and that appreciate. I was asking you questions that got a bit technical with it at times, so for the audience's sake. But I think it's so important. You don't want to start a business in a certain way just for the asset value. But like you said earlier, it's important to know why you're doing things the way you're doing them. Do you want high income? Do you want high asset value? Or how are you going to structure it? I think it's really important. And the way that the market and the industry is changing at the moment changes the values of so much. And people need to think about the end in mind when they start.
They do. And one last thing I'll add, before we close, if I may. I've done this for 32 years. I could easily afford to retire now, but I won't because I still enjoy it. And I get a tremendous thrill from achieving the best price for a business. We had one last year where we had 11 bids and it went for £6 million over the guide price. And
Wow.
No one was more astonished than I was when the bids came in. But that's where the market took us. And what I find very distressing is to read about the articles in the press which appear on a regular basis where people have sold a business for literally half what they should have done. And there's been some very high profile things reported in the Negotiator where businesses were sold for millions and millions of pounds less than they should have done. And it's not my opinion, it's an independent opinion, and they're not sales that I had anything to do with, so I can't claim that we got the right price. They're just people who made ghastly mistakes, tried to do it themselves, or chose the wrong broker, and that was the consequence.
Penny wise, pound foolish. A question that I can edit out if you're not comfortable with it, but what do you charge? How do you charge?
We charge a percentage of the sale price, and we are, I think, the only brokers left that work on a no sell, no fee basis.
Right, okay.
And, we are confident enough that we're going to sell it, that we will take the cost of marketing it, so the only way we get paid a fee is out of the proceeds of a successful sale.
Yeah.
We do turn away a lot of the things that we're offered. It's we don't agree with the guide price, or it's the wrong mix of sales and lettings, or there's compliance problems that we think are going to make the business difficult to sell.
Because sell no fee, you can't afford to
other
waste
reasons
time.
Like that.
Yeah.
But if we take it, it's on a no sell, no fee basis. And one of the biggest scams of all is the general practice brokers that cold call people. and they want, 10, 20, 30,000 pounds up front for a glossy brochure, which cost 50 quid, 500 quid to produce. And of course, once they've got that, you never hear another word. So many people have been caught like that over the years.
Yeah, I bet. I didn't even know that existed.
And we know because they come to us afterwards when it finally dawns on them.
Is it the sort of version, the second agent in?
Yeah.
I can appreciate that. Well, Adam, that's perfect timing because we're almost exactly at the hour mark. So all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for taking the time to come and be with me today and talk about this. I think it's such an interesting subject and I really appreciate it. So thank you. And for anyone who wants to get in touch with you, where do they find you?
So it's adam@adamjwalker.co.uk and www.adamjwalker.co.uk.
Got it all in. Perfect. Adam, thank you.
Okay.
And thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode of Property Porn Stars. We hope you enjoyed it and we'll catch you in the next episode.